Gabby, Z-Man, welcome back to 10% True. Thanks for joining me on the channel again. How you both doing?
Glad to be
Doing
here.
good, thanks.
It's good to see you.
Excellent. So the purpose of this short, well, it might not be that short, but the purpose of this episode is really to look at the recent MiG-23 UB crash that happened at the Michigan Air Show. I think middle of August, 13th of August, I think it happened 2023. And so what we're not going to do, or what you're not going to do, is try and sort of speculate and sort of do the job of the accident investigators. But there's been a really good interview with the backseat, a guy called Mark Ruff, that was conducted by Scott Purdue, whose Flywire YouTube channel I'll link to. And we're going to go through some of the clips, some of the things that Mark Ruff talks about in that video in terms of he was the backseater in the aeroplane, he initiated the ejection, and so what he was seeing and feeling and experiencing. And before we do that, though, the obvious question, especially for viewers who do not know who you are, is why would you know anything about the MiG-23?
Well,
Go ahead.
I'll go first on it. My name's Ted Drake, and I joined the 4477 Test Evaluation Squadron, which was running Project Constant Peg in April of '84, and I left in June of '87. Constant Peg were the guys that were flying the Russian MiGs, and I've got 147 missions, I think, in the MiG-21 and 294 missions in the MiG-23.
Gabby, am I correct in remembering that that made you the high time or the high sortie number MiG-23 pilot in the US Air Force?
It was certainly within our unit.
And Z, you were trained to fly the MiG-23. That's you in the background of your back job.
That's it. That's actually that's Ted's airplane. If I get my big head out of the way, you probably could zoom in, but it says has Ted's name on the side of that MiG-23 MS airplane. But yeah, my name's Rob Zettel, and much like Ted was in the Red Eagles. I got there maybe 4 or 5 months before Ted. I think I got there in September of '83, left in December of '86. Flew both MiG-21 and MiG-23. I think total time 478 total sorties in the airplanes, majority of which were in the MiG-21. I think I only had 138 sorties in the MiG-23, but it was a great experience, and that's why we're here talking to you today. And which again, it's nice to be back with you.
So the obvious question, and one of the things that people will ask, which is valid, is the aeroplane that was involved in the mishap was a MiG-23 UB, the two-seater. It does hark from the same family. There were sort of two families of MiG-23s, first generation, second generation, the air-to-air version we're talking about. You guys flew the MS, the Flogger E, which is the one in the background there behind you, Z. Would there be substantial differences between the UB and the aeroplanes that you flew that might contribute to perhaps it having different characteristics, or the way in which you would fly it or operate it being substantially different? In other words, are you sort of in a position where you can look at this and apply what you knew about the MS to the UB? Is that a valid thing to do?
I think they are quite similar, although there probably are a couple differences. When I look at the pictures of the cockpit of the UB front seat, it looks virtually identical to the MS, although he's added some stuff. You know, he added a GPS and stuff that we obviously didn't have, but most of the switches look pretty similar. It obviously was a two-seater, so we didn't have any of those. So as far as the ejection sequence, that wouldn't apply to the MS, to the Flogger E, although it is quite similar to an F4, the ejection sequence. And the other thing is, I think the engine we had in the MiG-23 MS was the Tamansky R29. The ground model had the Tamansky R29B, and I think the engine in the UB is a R27, which just puts out a little bit less thrust than the R29, but could have some other differences in it that I personally am not familiar with. What do you think, Z?
Yeah, I think you're basically right. I'm really not, and I'll say this up front, I'm not sure on the engine differential there. I've actually sat in the incident airplane. I met the owner pilot of that thing back in, I think it was February of 2015. So know a little bit about it. Sat in the airplane, did research. I was actually going to help them check out an airplane for different reasons. We won't get into. I elected not to do that, but I've looked over the flight manual, sat in the airplane, took tons of photos in preparation for what would have been a checkout in an airplane, but virtually, just like you said, it's almost identical. The biggest differences were in the backseat, like what you just said, Gabby. We didn't have no family models up at Tonopah and Red Eagles, but as I worked my way again, all the engine instruments or engine controls are on the left side, just outboard of your left arm. They're virtually identical. I mean, you can go down a schematic and they're identical to what we had in both the air-to-air and air-to-ground model.
And I'll, I think in the edit, Z, I'll put that picture you sent me across the screen so people can see the shot that you took.
Sure.
Just quickly, so I don't want to push you on something you don't want to talk about, and you've just said you don't want to get into the reasons why you didn't do it. But did you, you guys got a very quick checkout in the airplane, didn't you? In comparison to what you might go through with a B course or a TX, or even a TX course as an experienced fighter pilot going to a new MDS, a new airframe. Do you have views on just generally civilians flying complex warbirds like these? Is it a good thing for aviation history and for to educate the public on the Cold War, that kind of thing? Do you have personal views on whether these things should be sitting in museums or whether or not they should be flying?
You want to go first, Ted, or want me to wait?
No, I was going to let you handle that first.
Okay, hot potato in my lap. First off, I think they're great that they're flying. Having said that, as you go up the ladder in complexity of airplanes, there is also an inherent, I wouldn't say liability, but risk involved in flying and maintaining these airplanes. And as you alluded to, Steve, obviously when we flew in the Red Eagles, we had some of the highest level maintenance guys working on them 24/7. An almost unlimited supply of parts, even though sometimes they had to do a little fabricating on their own. But I think suffice to say, the level of maintenance on our airplanes is probably second to none in the Western world, and maybe even the Eastern world, just due to the expertise we had. Having said that, and because of the risk involved in flying these airplanes, especially like a Flogger, again, I say this because I don't want to rain on anybody's parade, and it's great to see these airplanes out there. But that risk is a real one. And as we saw, unfortunately, luckily, no one got hurt in this accident. I'm really glad both guys got out. But I've had discussions with people both at the FAA and other people that put on these air shows, and they have called me and asked me my opinion. It's just strictly my opinion. Is I'll let them know that this airplane is complex. And those people who say, well, it's no different than an L-39 or MiG-17, they really have no basis on which to make that judgment. Now, would love to see them flying. I have seen them fly. It's great. But I think everyone has to go forward knowing that there's a lot of risk in it. And again, civilian maintained airplanes, I'm not even going to speculate on what kind of budget people have to maintain it. It's tough. Think about maintaining an F-4 Phantom on your own. This is almost at that level. A highly complex airplane and a less reliable engine, and you only have one of them. So that's kind of all I'll say about that. However, it's great to see them out there flying, but I don't necessarily want to see them in a museum only, but maybe there needs to be a few more restrictions or regulations on it. I hate to even bring that up.
Okay. So, Gary, did you have any additional thoughts, or you're in line with?
Yeah, it's maintenance, logistics, and money. And as Z said, we had the best. Some of our crew chiefs were master sergeants. That's how seen. They were proud to be it. That was their airplane. But I don't know who's maintaining his plane on a daily basis, how much money he's got, if he needs a part, how long it's going to take him to get it, or what's going to happen there. I love to see him flying, but it almost, in my mind, needs to be an organization, sort of like the the Confederate Air Force or something like that, where they might have access to more money to be able to maintain better. Having said that, I don't know. He might have had great maintenance, but it is an issue, and certainly would be something on my mind.
Okay. And to be clear, before we hit record, you were at pains to make it clear that you supported the decision by Mark, the backseater, to initiate that ejection. So this really is about just going through and trying to expound on some of the things he's talking about, rather than in any way, shape, or form try to question his decision making or that of the pilot or the owner or anything like that. So let's get into what Mark Ruff said then. So if I start sharing screens. So this is the video then that's on YouTube. It's by, as I mentioned, it's Flywire. The channel is Flywire Scott Purdue. And Scott's a former F4 driver and also flew F-15E. So he's a fast jet, pointy nose kind of guy, knows what he's talking about. And anybody who's watching this should go and watch and subscribe to Scott's channel because it's excellent. But he does a really good job of sort of setting this up and extracting some of the details from Mark himself. I'm not entirely sure of Mark's background. In a way, it's sort of not really relevant to this conversation, but I think he's former Air Force. I think he was a heavy guy. And I think he may have some other MiG-21 type experience, having come out of the active duty Air Force at least. So the first clip we're going to listen to is Mark talking about the first indication there was something going wrong, or something wasn't right at least, and that was when the AB didn't light.
So at the time when he normally would light the afterburner, I said, light the burner. And it takes a couple of seconds for it to light. And also it takes a couple of seconds for it to come out of afterburner when you've selected it back out. Mm-hmm. So I see the throttle move forward, but the afterburner doesn't light. There's no kick, there's no acceleration that you feel in your chest when you're in afterburner in the MiG. And so
So you were getting ready to go to afterburner, so you can get the speed. What speed was your target?
Target would have been
450?
Yeah, 350 to 400.
Okay, so you didn't get that. You were what speed when you started?
Maybe 310, 320.
Okay. All right.
Yeah. So no acceleration, and then I see the throttle come back. I see it come all the way to idle, and then back forward, back into the afterburner range, still no light. And then the engine RPM starts to decay. So it is starting to unwind, and you feel that deceleration. And that's when I said, we need the wings to 16.
Okay, just before we talk about wing sweep then, what are your thoughts about that in terms of the characteristics of a potential engine failure that he's talking about? Is that something you guys ever experienced, anything that was in the books that you wrote when you were flying in the Red Eagles, or something you would know how to handle?
Nothing that I ever experienced. First of all, I'm not sure exactly where the wings were initially before they were going to 45 degrees. I get the feeling he did a flyby, or maybe just taken off with the wings at 16, was going to accelerate to put the wings to 45, which was when he lit the burner.
I think he said he had done a banana pass, this sort of swept wing pass at an angle around in front of the show line center.
I think you can do a banana pass with the wings at any setting, can't you?
Yeah, I believe that he was probably at 45 because he's talking about moving him to 16. So that would indicate to me they were at a previous setting of probably at least 45. I don't think they were past that.
Well, but he was talking about accelerating to get to the speed for the pass. If he already had the wings at 45, he wouldn't need to accelerate to get there.
Well, true. I'm guessing, if again, it's just speculation, and perhaps I need to review Scott's interview in total to pick up on it. They may have been planning on going faster and going back to 72. I don't know if they've already done one at 45. Yeah. Just my guess.
Yeah, the feeling I got from it, and it might not be right, was that they had the wings to 16 degrees for the takeoff and maybe for the first pass. They were going to go to 45. They had put the wings to 45 degrees. He went to light the burner to get the speed, which I don't think he would have really needed to have done that. I think mill power would have got him the speed. But I think for an air show, they might have just liked to have had the crowd hear the noise and see the burner, and maybe even see some of the shock diamonds. And then the burner didn't light. Now, between Z and I, we've flown the airplane 450 times. We probably lit the burner between 1,000 and 1,500 times, probably closer to 1,500. I've never had the burner not light, never.
Yeah.
There is a thing though, if you go to burner and you come out of burner, they wanted you to wait about 10 seconds before you went back into burner. So I don't know if him coming out of burner, going back to idle and coming right back into burner might have triggered an issue or not. But the thing of it is, there was an issue with the engine because the burner should have lit when he tried to light it.
Yeah.
See?
The one thing that, again, we're not trying to second guess anything, but just from all the evidence we can see, you know, the videos, the sound, audio, that kind of thing, and seeing the airplane going over, obviously the engine is, from all senses, it is running. It's obvious there is no afterburner, absence of noise and the plume. And you can't quite discern where the nozzle is, but it appears to be pretty wide open, which is, basically makes sense from what Mark is saying. He said the RPM started rolling back, which it will do if you have a nozzle failure, which everything appears that's what they're having. The engine's running. It's obviously not an afterburner, and you have decreasing RPM, all indicative of a nozzle failure.
I think probably many people watching this will know how jet engines work, and they'll understand the concept of containing the exhaust and creating pressure and that kind of thing. But can you just briefly explain why an open nozzle might result in decaying thrust coming out the back of the engine?
Go ahead, Gabby.
Yeah, when you're on the ground at idle, the nozzle's pretty much wide open. You don't want a lot of thrust there. As you run it up towards mill power, the nozzle starts closing down because you're telling the engine, I want thrust. And thrust is a function of pressure coming in versus pressure going out. And if you restrict the diameter of the pressure going out, it goes out of more pressure and provides more thrust. Then when you light the burner, as the temperature starts to rise in the engine, the nozzle will momentarily stay closed, but then it'll start opening back up to control the temperature, to make sure you don't over-temp the engine. And so that's what the nozzle does. And if the nozzle in flight goes wide open, it's got a larger opening there for that air to go through, and it produces less thrust.
Mm-hmm.
I did have a clip.
Z, you have anything to add to that?
No, that's pretty much it. I tell people, think about it like a choke on a shotgun. If you close it down, you get a pretty narrow field of beads coming out. But you open that thing wide open, you're going to scatter. And that's kind of what a wide open nozzle is. You're really dispersing your thrust. And again, everything appears that this is a failure of the jet nozzle flap control system. But without knowing exactly what their RPMs are and what kind of lights are coming on, we don't know. But all the indications point to this is what they had. Just saying.
Yeah, I would say that I still think there's a chance it was fuel control.
Could be.
Or could have even been throttle linkage, I guess. And the reason I say that is this. The one you talked about with J.B. Brown, the president of the Experimental Test Pilot Association, when they had the engine not respond to throttle, he was in, if I'm not mistaken, the accident airplane with the accident front seater in the front seat. And I don't know about the engine, but it could well have been the same engine. So they said first of all, they're doing the SFO, and the front seater says the engine isn't responding to throttle. I don't know how he would have known that, because when you're doing an SFO, the throttle's at idle. So if I was doing it, I probably wouldn't have known the engine wasn't responding to throttle until I throttled up for the go around in the flare or something. But maybe he noticed it before they got to where they were going to start the SFO. And J.B. Brown took it and they shut it down. They did an air start and the thing started back up. And then they climbed back up to a higher high key and they did an SFO type and landed the airplane. And the problem with that, he said, was, as I recall, was fuel control. So one of the things I would like to know, and I'm pretty sure the FAA or NTSB would like to know, is what did they fix in the fuel control? Did they replace the fuel control with a new one? Did they fix something was wrong with the old one? What happened there? The other incident I know of, this was, I believe, an R29B 300 engine, which I have reason to suspect is quite similar to the R27. We can talk about that later. Was one of our guys in the 4477 who was only on like TR3 in the airplane, going to low key, throttle unresponsive, engine unresponsive to throttle. He shuts it down, tries to restart. It won't light. He's in the middle of the SFO, and he said, out of frustration, I just took the engine and I shoved it to mill power and brought it back to idle. But he noticed the engine start light flickered once going up and once coming back. So he said, So he pushes the throttle up slowly till he gets it to the point where the engine start light comes on. He leaves it there, and the engine starts. And then eventually he lands from it, and he was able to duplicate that in the D-arm area, I think with our engine guy, Dennis Schumach there. And they said it was a throttle linkage type problem, and they had the airplane fixed, and it flew the next day with no issues from then on. So could have been any one of those three, but I'd guess probably nozzle or fuel control.
It is interesting that Mark doesn't make any reference to warning lights. I don't know if that's because it just all happened so quickly he didn't have a chance to look down. Were there sort of gongs, whistles, bells, attention grabbers at a sort of eye-line level in the aeroplane, not custom fit fire warning lights that you guys installed afterwards yourselves that caused you all these problems, but stock from the factory type equipment in the MiG-23 that would tell you of something like this?
Yeah, there was a telelight panel there on the right side. And again, this was the Flogger E. And I think his was very similar to that. That would tell you things like, I think it had engine failure on it. It had fire, it had overheats and things like that. I don't remember any oral tones going off, any warnings like that. But like I said, my memory of this is like 35 to 40 years old. So, and it's beginning to fade. Z, what do you remember from that?
Just like you said, you're going to have some caution lights over right above, in the Flogger Eve was right above your right knee on the instrument panel. And you are going to have a master caution light, which will kind of click and blink at you. I think there's actually located in 2 locations to punch it off. But you would have that, and especially I think in this, I think when you if you went to afterburner on the MiG-23 and you didn't have a light and it did not light off, I can't remember exactly what the light was called, but there was a light that would come on, and it may even said no light, no ignition, whatever it was. But there is going to be some indication that, but the other indication you're going to have immediately was that lack of thrust, by your nozzles probably not being open or not being closed rather. And you're going to see probably a definite decrease and maybe even a split in your high pressure and low pressure spools on the engine itself. So lots of things, but things are happening quick in the cockpit. And I'm sure these guys, especially Mark, again, I don't know what his level of expertise in MiG-23 is in the back seat. He's going to have similar instruments in the back. If he had the presence of mind of looking at them, he may have seen them, maybe it just didn't register, so I'll give him the benefit of the doubt on that. But things are happening quick. Yeah, things are happening quick when you're down low altitude like that, and you're quickly run out of airspeed and ideas.
So Mark talks in this clip, and he's saying put the wings forward, and you kind of just discussed a little bit about sort of where they would have been before and why move them forward. But the general principle behind slowing down in a wing sweep aircraft is that the slower you get, there's a kind of a schedule. The slower you get, the further the wings come forward. Is that correct?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the more the wings come forward, the more lift it generates, and so that's your best glide. All the things we would do when we would, a lot of our SFOs weren't from an overhead pattern. we'd just be out in the area working, and when the last knock it off call came or whatever, and we said goodbye to the guys, we just pulled the throttle idle and see if we could make the field. But you always traded off any of your excess airspeed for altitude, and then got the wings forward and picked up, I think our glide was like 230 to 250 or something. And that was giving us maybe just a little bit more than a 1-to-1, 1 mile per 1,000 feet glide ratio in it. I don't know how it really works in the Flogger because we didn't have any numbers for this, but like in the F-16, you had 2 numbers. One glide number was for your best glide distance. The second number, which was a little slower, was for your minimum VVI, which kept you airborne a little bit longer. So those things might have been coming into play a little bit because they certainly weren't going to make the field. And they might have wanted to have stayed airborne a little longer. I may have gone to half flaps on it. I don't think I would have gone. He went to full flaps. I think the full flaps just gave more drag than lift. And although I don't think it mattered at all in the end, I think it just, the inevitable was going to happen there. They were not going to be able to regain enough thrust with that engine soon enough to keep it from hitting the ground. And the only question was, were they going to still be in the airplane when it hit the ground or not?
Okay, we'll talk. Maybe we can talk a little bit about the flap settings and the compromises in just a minute when Mark references that. But the next bit, then he talks about resetting the nozzle. So if I play that bit here, this should be the right section.
Emergency when you need to close the nozzle. He might have started that, but then we needed to come left because we were planning on getting set up for a banana pass continuously on the south side of the airport.
So he's talking about resetting the nozzle. Does that ring any bells to you? Is that a procedure or something you could do that you trained to or remember?
Z?
Well, again, if he's alluding to the jet nozzle flap control system, that would be the only thing that comes to mind, the only way that you have any control over those. So if it in fact had failed, just outboard of your left elbow, slightly right below the canopy rail, there is a switch to position on and off to go ahead and either turn it, have it on, or turn it off. It's not working. He may be referring to that, but again, he's in the back seat. He's not in the front seat, and I can't say for certain if he has that control in the back seat. I kind of doubt it, but he might. But it would be a real quick decision and have the presence of mind of, oh, my nozzle's failed, I better go to the backup. Again, I'm speculating, but I think when you're talking about resetting nozzle, it may just be, hey, come out of afterburner, back to idle, and see if you can reset it that way and if it'll work. And that would be my initial inclination to do that if I were actually in the airplane, because you're not spring wired to, oh, it's my nozzle failure system or nozzle control system, I need to reset that. You're not spring loaded to that at all. It's more like, hey, let me set the hydromechanical, try that and see. And probably that could very well have worked. And like Ted said, if they had been an afterburner and then come out and then went right back into it, there may have been a reason why, with that 5 to 10 second delay, why they may not have gotten an AB light. And that, again, was just one more thing to add some, add some confusion to the situation right there. So,
yeah, and to be clear, so Mark, where he's talking here, he's talking, this is in reference to the preliminary report from the NTSB said that the front seater wasn't ready to go when the ejection took place, when Mark initiated the ejection from the back seat. And I think what Mark's saying here is he doesn't really know exactly what the guy in the front was doing, but his focus was on trying to work the problem, and he may have been trying to reset the nozzle. So I think he's referencing activity that might have been going on in the front cockpit. But does resetting the nozzle, what does that actually involve? Is it an electromechanical system then? Is it just turning off a system and powering it back on again? Is it sort of hydromechanical? Is it dumping pressure out of a system and then building the pressure back up again? Do you remember what it actually means?
I'll take that one. And I have the benefit of actually having the flight manual in front of me, but basically it's an electrical thing. You're bypassing the primary. And let me just read you a couple of things with it. And these are the symptoms And this, again, is indicative of what they experienced, but we're not for certain. But it says basically insufficient engine thrust with the engine running at non-reheat power. Okay, so you're not in afterburner and you're at full mill and you're not getting the thrust which you're expecting. That's exactly what they're having. Now, if this is a problem, then it matches up. We're not for certain. But again, this is symptom number one, exactly what they had. And if you're running at maximum power, the EGT, would be 100, 150 degrees below the maximum, but that's not what they had. And actually actions, and basically if you're in flight, it basically right away, it tells you to go ahead and turn that and flap control system, the engine exhaust jet nozzle flap control system tells you to turn that off. And basically, actually it turns on the switch, continue flight, and you're going to have to now modulate and watch what you're doing, because you could put the throttle all the way up to a maximum, not reheat, but mill power, and the nozzle's now going to close down, but it doesn't have any of the protections you previously had. So it'll close down as much as you're calling for, and you could easily overtemp the engine. So what it's calling for is, hey, be careful when you do this, because you don't have any of those protections. So you're probably going to have to come back something a lot less than full mill power, so you don't overheat the engine. And that's pretty much, let's see, yeah, and that's kind of it right there. But it's pretty simple. It's just turn the system on, the emergency nozzle switched on, and you should regain control. Don't know if they ever did that or not. And they may have, and it may not have had any bearing on it.
Gabby, you got anything else to add to that?
No, I just want to reiterate one more time. It's really easy for Z and I to sit here behind our desks after having read through some of the ops manuals and talked about it to come up with a few of the uncertainties that they were looking at in just a few seconds. And I certainly don't want, I know Z doesn't, we're not second guessing these guys. They had the emergency belongs to the people in the airplane at the time, and they did the best they could with what they had. And we're just trying to add a little Monday morning perspective to it.
The other thing with that switch, again, it's once you turn that switch on, the emergency nozzle switch on, you have no chance of lighting the afterburner after that, because again, it's protection. If it could, you'd probably blow off the back end of your engine because that nozzle would close down and it wouldn't open up. So that's just one other thing. If people turn on thinking they're going to regain the capability of relighting the afterburner, then there's no possibility of that happening either.
Okay, so I think the next interesting thing Mark talks about, and I'm not a professional aviator, let alone a fighter pilot, but to me this sounded like some really good situational awareness as he starts calling out the airspeeds as the airspeed's decaying and the buffet starts coming on the airplane. I just wanted to play that clip and get your thoughts on it.
I start calling out airspeeds as the airspeed is now bleeding down below 250 knots, below 220 knots, and we got into a little bit of that buffet that you talked about, elephants on the wing. The airplane's rumbling.
Yeah,
right?
if they're dancing, they're just kind of dancing, they're on their toes. That means you're outperforming, but that's the airway brake. It's correct. Progressing up the wing.
Yes, so the air is no longer normalized over the top. It is starting to separate.
So again, most people watching this will understand basic aerodynamics and airflow separation and the stall and that kind of things. But can you talk a bit about how that manifests, particularly in the MiG-23? I know you will both be, well, everybody who's familiar with the story will be recalling Mark Postow, who sadly died, trying to coax a MiG-23 back to tone and power, and unfortunately just didn't have the legs, and then the ejection sequence went wrong for him, unfortunately. But he tried to save the aeroplane by coaxing it to the runway. What sort of feedback did you get from the MiG-23 when he talks about that light buffet? Is that familiar to you as something that you would experience in the landing pattern, or only something you would really want to be feeling when you were BFMing, or not that you BFM'd the jet, but when you were performing the airplane?
Well, certainly with the wings at 16 degrees, you never max performed the jet with the wings at 16 degrees. They were only good for four things: takeoff, land, ferry, and loiter. Okay. And the airplane is less steady the further the wings are forward. So it is the most unstable with the wings at 16 degrees. And I think the angle of attack limit there was like 16 or 17 units. I never got close to that. I never felt buffet in it, in the traffic pattern, which was about the only time you ever flew it there, and never got close to the angle of attack limit. And of course, the other thing you got's a knuckle wrap. I don't know if their knuckle wrapper was going or not, but the knuckle wrapper was always an indication when you got that, the stick came forward. Before I flew the MiG-23, I laughed at the concept of a knuckle wrapper. After I flew it, I didn't laugh. I thought it worked pretty well. Calling out the airspeeds. Obviously, that's important. But it also, the calm between the front and the back seater, going back to an F4 type thing. Whenever you get calm coming in, it ruins your train of thought just a little bit. The human brain's a wonderful thing, but it's also a very simple thing. It doesn't multitask well, in spite of what your wife might try to tell you. So you're concentrating on something, trying to figure it out, and you get something in the front seat, and then you got to answer it, and that slows you down just a second or two. But if I'd have been in the back seat, I'd have been given the airspeeds too, because that's critical. So I actually thought, from what I've seen on these tapes, that the calm from the back to the front wasn't excessive, and I thought it was relevant.
Okay.
Yeah, I agree with Gabby. I think Mark did. His piece of it was what he could see, and all he had control over it was exactly that, visual, and he can call that out and just have the presence of mind to be looking out the airplane, because I'm sure the front seater was focused right in front of him right there. And again, his jet, he doesn't want to have to get out of his nice warm cocoon unless he absolutely has to. But Mark's input was totally right on.
There is one thing interesting about the engine gauges on a Russian airplane, MiG-21 and MiG-23, that I know of. Whereas our RPM gauge only shows like the N2 rotor, the high-speed rotor, theirs shows both high and low speed. You've got two needles, and one of them's got a 1 on it, and one's got a 2 on it. And so you can see what both rotors are doing at the same time. And that can give you more information, but it also is a little bit more complex trying to figure out and troubleshoot those things.
Let's pick up the lift device conversation. Then let's just listen to Mark talk about calling for flaps.
At any given time. And he agreed, so he selected flaps to take off. I can look out over the wing and I can see the slats come in, and there's little notches across the top of the wing when the flap is down that stick up. They're just pieces that go forward of the hinge, so they stick up a little bit. So I think, okay, that's going to buy us a little bit of time. The speed continues to decay. So now it's progressing down to 190, 180.
And your altitude?
Our altitude, he's having to trade. He felt the buffet too, so he's having to lower the nose to trade. So our altitude is now decreasing. I would say 800 AGL or less.
So you've already mentioned, Gabby, then that the finality of this flight was a foregone conclusion. As soon as that engine stopped producing thrust and whatever they did, it was going to end up somewhere other than the runway. Can you just talk us through the pros and cons then of using high lift devices when you've got no thrust? You've already said it creates more drag. Do you go to takeoff flap? Do you go to mid flap? Whatever. What are the considerations?
It basically allows you to fly at a slower airspeed without exceeding the angle of attack. So flaps coming down, allow you to slow the airplane down without stalling it, but it also causes drag. And if you've got engine thrust, like you do in the traffic pattern, it's no biggie. You just add enough thrust to counteract the drag and keep the speed to where you want it. If your engine's failed, you don't have that thrust. And he's already said that because of the buffet, he has unloaded the airplane a little bit, which now they're starting to go downhill. They've got a downward vector, which is going to impact them greatly once they pull the handle and the seats go out of that thing.
He says, Mark says, so I think it's, we'll play it. This is what he says about going to full flap. Here we go.
And I said, we need flaps full. He agreed, selected flaps to full. So now they've tracked all the way out. At this point, we have cashed in our energy. either we get the engine back, and I mean roaring back, and then we can level off, and then we can clean up, which is retract flaps, accelerate, get on the front side, and then climb up. And then at that point, you would want to go to high key, essentially.
Okay, so we're going to talk about the SFO pattern in just a minute, but it is now a done deal, isn't it? There is nothing else they can do. 800 feet AGL, that's extremely low, isn't it? Do you, again, this is, this is just asking for your thoughts and observations, but would you have been inclined to get out sooner?
Yeah, I would have. I mean, Air Force procedures, every airplane I've ever flown was, if you're out of control, you jump out 10,000 AGL. If you're under control, you can wait to 2,000 AGL. Engine failure on takeoff in an F-16 is zoom and boom, trade off any excess airspeed you might have for altitude, but get out before there's a sink rate. So they would have been justified, as soon as that engine was unresponsive to throttle, they would have been justified in my mind in pulling the handle right then. As I said, when I was talking about the other things, I'm not second guessing these guys. They decided that full flaps was what they wanted to do at the time. They were in the plane. I wasn't. So I'm not criticizing those guys at all for it. But the backseater waited literally almost to the last second. If you look at the altitude difference between the backseater getting a shoot and the front-seater getting a shoot, they're significantly different, and that's because the airplane is picking up more of a downward vector. And if you've ever done vector analysis, you just add those up and you see the result. And the front seater, I think, gets a shoot, 300 or 400 feet maybe in the air. Yeah, so I think if they would have waited another 5 seconds, I think the front seater would have been dead. And 10 seconds, I think they would have both been dead. So they would have been justified in going much earlier. They stayed with it, I think, as long as they could have possibly stayed with it and not just died either with the plane or in a partially open chute.
Yeah, the one thing that stuck out from what Mark said there, he talked about maybe 800 feet and 180, 190 knots. When you're doing your typical overhead pattern, like we did up at Tonopah, 800 feet is basically halfway down, because you start at 1,500 feet AGL. So you're almost halfway through the turn as you come around, and you're about 180, 190 knots in a turn, but that's with a working engine at full flaps, gear down. Of course, they didn't have gear down here, but those kind of numbers are like, yeah, you're halfway through the final turn. Everything's configured, you're, stabilized approach, that kind of thing, with a good engine, and they didn't have any of that. So I looked at that and I'm going, wow, that's frightening right there. Yeah, but so good on them that they got out.
Can I ask a bit of an emotive question then? Well, emotive in terms of maybe the answer rather than the question itself. But one of the things that, does the rounds when you hear about aviation incidents, particularly, pointy nose type ones where an aeroplane has crashed in a field and the pilot has not managed to make it out, the crew haven't made it out. As you hear these things about, well, they stay with the aeroplane to steer it away from the primary school or the bus full of nuns or whatever it is. And I just wondered, I'm sure there are cases where that has happened, where someone has stayed with the aeroplane because they made that decision. I'm sure that's happened, but I'm not sure that it's as common as people think. And so I just wanted to ask you, as very seasoned fighter pilots, whether you pre-visualized that scenario in your own careers. Did you ever think about how you would handle an emergency? You just talked, Ted, about getting out at 2,000 feet if you're in controlled flight. If you're flying over a city or you're flying over an urban area where it might hit some people, kill some people on the ground. Did you ever think about that? Or were you resolved that you were going to follow the regulation at 2,000 feet, you were going to pull the handles?
I thought about it, but you don't make the decision to eject at that time. You make the decision to eject whether you're going to do this or not way earlier, years earlier. What am I going to do? And if you're in a populated area like they sort of were, the houses, the rooftops and stuff stand out to you. But what doesn't stand out quite as much is all the open space. There's a good bit of open space. There's roads and backyards and things like that. And the plane's going to skid and things, and you would try to point it towards an area that's unpopulated. But I wasn't going to die trying to make sure of that. I was going to pull the handle and hope that I'd done the best I could and that the airplane missed houses. And if I'd hit a house that there was nobody in it at the time. So that was just my thing. I was going to get out of the plane.
Less of a consideration in Fusey because you had two engines in your F-15.
Yeah, oftentimes you got two engines, but when you have one, you think about it. Of course, those of us who are up at Tonopah or you're based out of Nellis and you spent the majority of your time over the open range, that decision is pretty easy. You just get out because it's not going to hit anybody. Yeah, I think it would be a difficult decision, but I can't say, again, having the benefit of just sitting here in my nice cozy office, that yeah, I'm going to have all kinds of time to make that decision. It's going to be tough because you're in the heat of the moment. The one thing that you don't have, that a lot of people obviously who have not flown the airplane, is you're not going to have a lot of great control over that MiG-23 when it starts getting mushy like that. You start getting down to 180 knots. You're not going to have a lot of choice on where the airplane's going. It's coming down like a pile of pancakes. And yeah, you might be able to steer a little bit left or right, 5-10 degrees, but where it's going to end up, you're going to have almost zero control. So whether you stay with it or you get out, matters not really, except for your life. Get out quick.
Yeah, the one other thing about the ejection sequence in all airplanes, but in the MiGs especially, there is risk with bailing out of an airplane. What happens if the seat doesn't fire? What happens if the carts they gave us weren't the best ones? What happens if the man-seat separation doesn't work? There have been pilots hit the ground still in their seats. What happens if the chute doesn't open fully? There's a lot of risk associated with that, and you're managing risk.
Yeah, that's interesting, isn't it? I was going to talk at the end about sort of the fact that the KM1 seats on the airplane on this mishap aircraft both work brilliantly, flawlessly, and I think again from the JB interview or the presentation he gave at the Peninsula Scenas, which I'll link to somewhere in the video description, I think he talked about them replacing the cartridges, the pyrotechnic cartridges on those seats. So it's good. Somebody's owed a case of beer or something or another for doing a great job of maintaining those seats. Let's have a quick look then at what he says about, there's some numbers that are going to come up on the simulated flame-out profile.
For a simulated flame-out, which would be 16,000, 17,000 feet above the airport, I was able to get an emergency call out.
So I just was curious about those numbers. 17,000 feet, I'm assuming this is AGL. Do you really need 17,000 feet to do an SFO in a MiG-23?
They flew their SFOs apparently significantly looser than we flew ours. We used to climb. When we'd take off an afterburner, and we would climb to low key before we'd terminate afterburner. In case the engine quit when that happened, you could do a flame-out landing. And as I recall, that was around 12,000 feet, which was about 7,000 above the field. 6,500, 7,000 above the field. And they're saying low key there is like 12,000 feet above the field. So they were flying theirs, I guess, significantly looser than we were flying ours. And I don't blame them for that. All the guys in our unit, once again, if you were you needed 1,500 hours of fighter time, which was 7.5 or 8 years of hard fighter flying. Air Force guys were all aggressors or weapons school graduates. Our 3 Navy guys, we had 2 Top Gun instructors from Miramar and an East Coast aggressor from Oceana. And our Marine guy was a Marine Air Weapons Tactics instructor from Yuma. So we had by far the most experienced squadron I've ever seen or heard of. But that was how we flew our SFOs. And it seemed pretty comfortable to me. It was looser than an F-16. An F-16 high key is about 7,000 feet. Low key is about 3,500. Base key is about 2,000. So, but the F-16 is a lot more maneuverable, even with an engine out, than a MiG-23 is.
Yeah.
Let me just say that, that when we did practice the SFOs, I think generally we looked at right at 250 knots. And you had obviously your gear and flaps were up, but you did have speed brakes. So throttle idle, speed brakes out. And so you flew fairly tight, But yeah, we were like Ted said, about 12,000 AGL for our high key. But you came down and ruled with a real good eyeball on the airspeed, and if it deviated below 250, you make sure you inch down that nose ever so slightly and harden up the turn to make sure you hit your gates to come back around. But you'd roll out in the final a couple thousand feet, but you had a boatload of VVI descent going into you.
Yeah, the general rules for SFOs was always better to be high than low, always better to be fast than slow, because you can get rid of energy in an SFO. You can do S turns, you can put some G, some angle of attack on it, things like that, but you can't gain it.
Just, this isn't really relevant to this conversation, but it's I'm curious to know if you guys know the answer to it. How do they, how does the FAA regulate or evaluate or sign off on these kinds of things? Do these guys flying these experimental types go out and put these numbers together and they do what they want to do, or is there a process where the FAA will look at this and say, no, you're too slow, you're too far, you're too low, going back to the mantra you just talked about, Ted? But will they do that, or is this just up to the operator to decide?
From what I could tell, I think that guy J.B. Brown was maybe an FAA type designee or something, because I think he gave the check out to Dan Files. And I think in one of Brown's briefings, he showed kind of an ops manual. See, the ops manual that Z's got is in knots and kilograms per square centimeter. It's metric. I think the one that Brown's got, they have changed those things over to knots and PSIs and things like that. So my sense is that Brown gave Files his type rating. Now, I would assume that Brown, as president of the Experimental Aircraft Pilots Association, probably got that cleared through the FAA one time, and that was probably what Files was using as his FAA authorization. I don't know that for sure. What do you think, Z?
I don't know. I can't speak to what kind of credentials GB has. Obviously, an experienced guy, so I'll just leave it at that. I do know that the process, this from the periphery, having talked to a guy at the FAA who used to be in charge of FAA Warbird certifications, that kind of thing. Actually, I had him on my jump seat at United one day for 2 hops going out to San Diego, and we had a couple hours to talk about all this stuff. I'll just say, when I left there, I was not too impressed at the quality control as far as who's getting checked out in airplanes and what their experience is, because I asked that specific question, especially he was interested after he learned what I had flown. And so I asked him, well, how do you check somebody out in like a single seat MiG-21 or MiG-23? He says, well, if we have somebody that's flown it, and if we have a chase airplane available, which they almost never do, we will do that. Otherwise, we'll see that they have all the proper documentation, the pilot's operating handbook. We'll listen to their brief, watch them do a takeoff, landing. So I asked him quite frankly, forwardly, and I go, so that's it? He goes, yeah, that's pretty much it. So for those of us, I don't think I'm going on a limb here, but those of us who flew in the Red Eagles, and I wouldn't say we punished those airplanes. We probably flew those MiGs harder than anybody has ever flown MiGs anywhere in the world. Or really, I think I can honestly say that. And I think we had the expertise to back that up. No one flies it, nor should they fly them that hard, that heavy in the civilian world. Now, also having said that, is I just don't know the extent of their expertise, systems, handling knowledge of the airplane. So, again, L-39 is one airplane. MiG-21 goes up appreciably in complexity, even though that's pretty easy. MiG-23 is a whole nother quantum leap. And, I'm a little skeptical of credentials of people flying these airplanes without a whole lot of experience, but that's just me. So that's my editorial on that. I like to see him fly, but a lot of risk there.
Okay. And so then at this point, I think he's talking about then the ejection process. And I'm not going to go through all of it because he describes it in detail. It's actually a very interesting description. He seems to have been sort of seared into his memory, that experience. But let's see what he says about this, the AOA split.
And that's that angle of attack split. And that's when, and you feel that it's not a ground rush, but you're just aware that the things in your peripheral vision are getting higher.
They're coming up this way.
They're coming up this way.
Yeah.
And that's when I said, eject, 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 and I grabbed and squeezed the pistol grips, you rotate at the elbows, and that's when the sequence started. And it is an intense amount of violence. It is hard to understate. The KM1 seat is an amazing seat. I am so glad that it exists and that the excellent professionals put the charges in correctly and that the excellent professionals maintain that seat.
So he punched out. It worked. We've seen the pictures. We've seen the video, and so the end of the story is written. And as you both said, thank goodness it was. Nobody got hurt either in the airplane or on the ground. So, just quickly, I wanted just anecdotally to ask you about that seat. Then, so, there were at various points in the history of the airplane that you were flying in the unit you were flying with. There were points at which it was distrusted, but generally, did it have a good reputation among Eastern Bloc or Russian forces for being a reliable seat?
Yeah, our feeling at the time, and we didn't have a lot of data on it. The information that I had was a third of the people that used it got out with little or no injury, a third were seriously injured, and a third died. Those numbers included out-of-envelope ejections. There were three ejections that I'm aware of in the Air Force. 2 were fatal, 1 was no injuries. Of the 2 that were fatal, the 1 was definitely an out-of-envelope low and slow, and the other one was probably top of the envelope very, very fast. Maybe even out of the envelope on the high end of the thing. Since the program went unclassified, I've been in contact email with an East German MiG-23 guy, and he said that the numbers were, when you took the out-of-envelope things out of it, the numbers were pretty good, and they had confidence in the seat. And the ejection looked very good on the film from this one. So that was our feelings on the seat. And certainly the one that we had that was in the envelope, the thing worked pretty flawlessly.
Okay, well, I think that wraps it up. I think, certainly from the perspective of Scott Purdy's interview there with Mark Roth, I think those are the salient points that I wanted to cover with you. So, but before we sort of conclude the video, is there anything else that you wanted to share? Any observations that you made? Any thoughts? I mean, obviously, you're not here to act as accident investigators, but rather just, as we said right at the beginning, to provide some illumination on some of the things that Mark talks about or what we've seen mentioned. Anything else that you would add to it?
I think the only thing I would add is, go ahead, Z.
No, I've got nothing more to add. I think we covered. I think you stated very well. We're not here second guessing, and they made a good decision to get out, and thank God they're fine. And sorry to see them lose an airplane, which would everyone from all appearances, seeing it fly, just love to see it. It is an impressive airplane when you see it flying. So it's a shame we lost one, but the good news is no one got hurt.
Yeah, it's especially impressive right around sunrise or sunset in burner, because the shock diamonds are the length in the afterburner are the length of the airplane. The only other thing that I would kind of add was, I think it was in one of J.B. Brown's things, maybe, they were talking about a command select valve in the back seat, sort of like we had in the F4. I'm not sure they had that, but if they did, the way the briefings usually went in the F4 was, if your backseater was an inexperienced guy, you didn't know him, you didn't trust his judgment very much, you usually said, leave the command select valve vertical. If you decide to go, you go, but I'll make my own decision when I go. But if the backseater was someone you trusted, had good judgment, you knew well, the briefing usually was totally different. It usually was rotate that command select valve on the ground, leave it there the whole flight. If the plane's not good enough for you, it's not good enough for me. If you decide to leave, take me with you. And if the plane had a command select valve, I have to think that in their pre-flight briefing for this, they probably decided that they were going to rotate that command select valve, and whichever seat went, both would go. And I think that turned out to be a good decision. Like I said, we're not here to second guess them. We weren't in the airplane. The emergency belongs to them. They handled it as best they could. They came out with about as good an outcome as you could, which was 2 good shoots and nobody hurt on the ground. And I'm just glad they didn't put the decision off any longer than they did.
Okay. Well, that's a great conclusion, a great summary. On which note, then we'll say thank you, Z-Man and Gabby, for joining us once again on the 10th Century channel. And we'll wait and see what the NTSB comes out with as the final conclusion. But appreciate your time. It was great seeing you both again.
Great seeing you, Steve. Thanks for having us.
Thanks for tuning in to 10th Century. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Feel free to subscribe, and if you're on YouTube, hit the bell button to make sure you get notified of the next episode. Thanks and take care.